Okay, I'm thinking that we should probably get started. We do have a number of people who've registered who haven't joined us yet, maybe struggling with WebEx or internet access or whatever, but I think that perhaps we should get started. Toby, you're recording, am I right?
Yes, we recorded and we will put it on YouTube probably tomorrow, depending on when we get the recording from WebEx.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. This is webinar 1 in the Change the World series. Our ambitions are not too high, as you can tell, for our webinar series, what we hope to achieve. The series is co-hosted by the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice and the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum, and FIXT. I'm from FIXT. The series is in part a preparation for submissions to be made to the UN Crime Congress in March 2021, and in part an opportunity for a diverse range of urban safety actors to discuss integrated approaches to safety, policing, mental wellness, knowledge and data, and to create a collaborative systems response to global unsafety. I think I'll just give Anna, and I'm not sure if Louise is aware that I'm going to ask her if she'd like to introduce UPCOF, but just give Anna an opportunity to introduce the Alliance, to say a few words about the Alliance.
Okay, perhaps without a video because it doesn't respond. Yeah, it responds. Okay. Hi, everybody. As Emma said, yes, this is one event co-hosted by the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. That is an umbrella organization bringing together many NGOs and individual experts dealing with the prevention of crime and criminal justice. These topics are very broad. This is a wide range of issues that go from organized crime, corruption, but also includes crime prevention, urban safety, and imprisonment, policing. Many of the issues that large communities of practitioners may be dealing with separately as a sort of silos. So one of the ambitions of this series would be to bring together different communities to make sure that we speak with one voice and we are more effective in achieving this global urban safety. Thank you very much and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Anna. Louise, I wonder if you'd like to just take the opportunity to give us an introduction to sort of UPCOF and your background and your participation in this process.
I would, and apologies for having the camera off. I don't have childcare this late in the day, so I'm not alone, and I'm just managing that this side. But I'm Louise Edwards. I'm from the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum. Sean Tate will be joining us. We've had another meeting to run over. I mean, UPCOF, we work across the continent in terms of police oversight and accountability, but our work really is located in a broader kind of democratic governance, crime and violence prevention, community safety sort of discourse. So our interest in this is very much in terms of setting that agenda, not just for Africa, but globally. And Sean, I'm sure when he comes into the meeting, will sort of speak more to our specific objectives on this, but it's just really great to be part of the process.
Thanks very much, Louise, and thanks for joining us while multitasking with a small person. So in today's discussion, we will be thinking about partnerships and collaboration. We accept for the purpose of this webinar series that urban safety is complex sectoral stakeholders to be sustainably solved. So today we ask ourselves, how can we strengthen current approaches to partnership? What is making partnerships fail, and how do we learn from these failures about how to innovate to sustain them, about how to create a conducive working environment for multi-sectoral actors to bring diverse, sometimes discrepant, sometimes complementary expertise, networks and capacities and resources to a collective problem-solving approach. So I'm Emma de Villiers from Fixed Africa in Johannesburg. I'm a consultant facilitating partnerships and collaboration for systemic collective effort in a range of settings, including private sector, local and national government, civil society, community-based organizations, the media, and I'll be facilitating the conversation today. On our panel, we have Elizabeth Johnston, who is the Executive Director of the European and French Forums for Urban Safety. I wasn't sure whether that was supposed to be fora or forums.
Forum.
Forum. Oh, but European and French.
Yes,
Forum.
but yes,
That's
it's
the plural. Okay, great. Excellent. A bit of grammatical learning. These are both networks of local and regional government institutions focused on building knowledge and knowledge systems for shared sustainable safety practice. I'm doing brief bios. I think that if you want more information about our lovely speakers, we can certainly share that as part of our reporting process. We have Alexandra Abello-Kolak at the London School of Economics, Latin America and Caribbean Center, focusing in her research on dynamics of urban violence and building participatory methodologies for co-creating responses to urban violence and security provision in vulnerable communities in Latin America. It's always a bit dangerous to introduce people rather than allowing them to introduce themselves. And then we have Janice Aikida, who is joining us from 4 a.m. in Hawaii. So we're just really excited that she's taken the time to be with us. Executive Director of Vibrant Hawaii, a grassroots NGO established in Hawaii in 2017 to facilitate cross-sector collective action to build mutually reinforcing efforts to reduce poverty in Hawaii. And we have Daniel Mack, recently relocated from Sao Paulo, Brazil to Berlin to take up the position as Program Lead for Violence Reduction at Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies, an international coalition of cities and NGOs responding to violence around the globe, also with an ambitious mandate of halving global violence in the next decade. So there's nothing stopping the things that we're planning to achieve here today. So thanks very much to all of you for joining us. And well, as I said, particularly to Janice, who's very early. So the event today will take the form of a conversation. We have some themes we'd like to cover around the role and meaning of partnership, some experiences and examples of partnership, highlighting what makes it work and what makes it difficult, what can be achieved when we get it right, and some personal reflections from our panelists on their experiences around the structural engagements around collaboration, some of the barriers and structures. So Toby, if you could share our slides, aside from this slide, which Toby's going to share with us in a minute, we won't be using presentations for our discussion. We really want to just have a conversation. I've been so enjoying listening to Michelle Obama's podcasts, which are these lovely conversations around the dinner table. So I decided we should take that kind of format today. So if participants have any questions, please put them in the chat. I will monitor the chat and ensure that if a question doesn't come up immediately, that we will come back to it later on in the conversation. We'd really like to have a lively discussion. This is an area of work that many of us, even from very, very diverse sectors and backgrounds, have experience with and grapple with sort of on a day-to-day basis. So we'd really like to draw everybody's insights and experience out and think about what kind of recommendations we might have as an output of this discussion, potentially including a toolkit to support partnership. So yeah, please do raise your insights and questions, and I will, as I say, monitor the chat. So the slide that I'm sharing with you, we've called the Collaboration Continuum. the frame of mind and the public cultural or contextual setting in which we enter into partnerships will impact the outputs that we can expect from them. So, the continuum starts with tick box consultation motivated by fear and scarcity. We have to comply. But that fear, that belief that partners cannot be trusted, partnering is often undertaken in compliance rather than based on the belief that there is value in partnering. And our proposition here, obviously, is that where that is the case, we are less likely to be able to deliver the powerful outcomes that partnership is really able to deliver. So we propose that this kind of consultation is flawed, perpetuates low trust, dissatisfaction, and can often do more harm than good, leaving actors feeling unheard, isolated, even angry and frustrated. The continuum, as you can see, moves through various sort of increasingly integrative approaches and culminates in shared leadership and, true collaboration for sustainable change. So what we're proposing is that where it's possible to build resilient relationships based on trust and where power can be shared, it's possible to be transparent, to share accountability, share the risks of innovation, and to share successes, and to build interventions which are better because they are collaborative and integrated. So I think we might come back to this slide a little bit later on, and of course we can circulate it to anybody who's interested, but I think, Toby, we can take it down for now. Elizabeth, I wanted to start by saying to you that we were having a conversation yesterday where we were talking about the notion, I was suggesting that the notion that partnership is necessary has achieved widespread acceptance, that people know it's necessary and important, but they don't always think about how complex it is. And you were saying, well, I'm not so sure.
Yes, thank you, Emma. I was saying, well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm super happy to see all of you and share this first step of changing the world in a series of webinar, which I'm very excited about, all of them. Today, I was saying, indeed, when we were chatting about this, I think people maybe understand it's necessary, but the way a lot of people, I think, understand it at the end of the day is as a necessary evil. So it's not necessarily something that is that we should take for granted, that partnership is accepted as a way of operating and as a sort of a basis for the framework for action. I think in many cases it's seen as a necessary evil, and even though it will not be presented as that, I think there's a sort of an understanding that one on principle everyone agrees, and it's this sort of politically correct in our world attitude to be very partnership prone and to have at least in appearance, an openness to partnership. I think a lot of, and you were just saying, you were just mentioning it, a lot of partnerships are actually undertaken in compliance and or under strict necessity. So I think the real issue for me is how we not only better expressed sort of the idea of shared interest and common ground, but also the actual added value of partnerships, not as, again, a politically correct thing to say, of course, we want to work all together and, everyone, all the agencies or all the different levels of government, because this is I'm talking about as much about horizontal partnership as vertical partnerships. The idea of state and local cooperating, the idea of police and justice sectors cooperating with other sectors is, yes, in principle acquired, but in reality, when you're sort of in the behind closed doors, I think a lot of people just think it would be so much simpler if we could just do this by ourselves, and we basically know what there is to do. And yes, we have to humor everyone with partnership meetings, but they're sort of a constraint more than a real added value. So I think identifying and finding ways to really highlight the added value is the challenge we have. which is sort of an indispensable step for further partnerships.
Thanks. I mean, what's interesting about that is it kind of seems that there's actually an opportunity for some advocacy as well. So it's not just about how to make it possible, but it's an opportunity to kind of think about how we build a real sort of shared sense of value of partnership. Daniel, unfortunately, your screen is flashing again, so I wonder if we might have to live without your video. Sorry,
I'm happy to turn off my video.
Well, now it stopped flashing again, but I mean,
maybe it works when you're speaking. You know, I think one of the things, Emma, is that to me is one of the questions that I'd be interested in also hearing everyone else's opinion, is this sort of tension between partnerships needing to be formalized and institutionalized so that they become sustainable. Which is obviously something we want and we've been pushing for, definitely at the European Forum, is something we advocate for. On the other hand, you know, once they're too formal, then it does become a compliance sort of format. So we're torn, and this tension between this need to formalize and the need to be for the partnerships, on the contrary, to be agile and activated only when relevant. So this is, it's this tension that I feel, you know, is maybe one of the topics we could explore and try to make progress on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that issue of MOUs, you know, and the MOUs take months and months to sign, and by the time we've reached the point that we've agreed on what we're going to do, the things that we wanted to do are actually no longer necessary anymore or relevant. And you know, so also very often the person doing the implementation is not the person signing the contract, which also kind of creates a barrier and a gap. And as you say, a lack of flexibility, a lack of ability to really participate in an organic way that is responsive to the kinds of opportunities that are emerging. Daniel, you were also talking about partnership as a buzzword, saying it's kind of something people do as a token to the trip, and how this tends to limit some of the work that needs to be done up front in order to build reliable and resilient partnerships.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you very much to the Alliance and to Fix and Emma and all the organizers for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I should say that my kind of background when thinking of partnerships is a lot of it has to do with my previous experience in a Latin American NGO, an NGO based in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and kind of city government and law enforcement partnerships. And now, more recently, as of 2 months ago, as Emma noted, I'm with Pathfinders, and that, which in itself is a partnership. It's a multi-stakeholder partnership with governments and cities and civil society and international organizations. And one of our in this very broad umbrella of having global violence, which is this very, very easy and quick mandate. I think I'll probably finish it in a couple of years and then go on vacation. But in any event, one of our main pillars there is, in fact, Peace in Our Cities, which is a network of city governments and local civil society and international partners as well. So a lot of, I guess when I speak of partnership, oftentimes I'm talking about civil society partnership with city governments and local governments. But indeed, I think oftentimes, and I think Elizabeth was referring to this, is that sometimes the very notion of partnership is something that's somewhat imposed by kind of the traditional way of doing things, or sometimes in an even more artificial manner because of perhaps donor and funding priorities or definitions and other kind of artificial or non-organic ways of defining partnership. And I think that's something that's a very important first question is to think the very basic questions. Why should we do a partnership? What's the purpose? Who should be in it? And all the traditional very basic W questions. And I think in the absence of that, you really run the risk of doing it for the wrong reasons, using the wrong strategies, partnering with the wrong organizations or individuals. And so, like, I think that kind of initial mapping and really perhaps an inward-looking exercise of one's own organization and one's own strategy to really define whether partnership, is the best way forward, and if so, what sort of partnership? Because of course that there's, the permutations of modalities and possibilities are tremendous. So I would say the first thing to do, in fact, is to define whether it's necessary. I think if we're talking, I think it has in fact become a bit of a buzzword in a larger, perhaps a social justice world where kind of the default motion is always partnership, and I would posit that that's not always the case. But I think if we bring the lens down a bit to some of the aspects we perhaps would focus more on, particularly on urban safety and urban violence reduction, that's an area that there's a lot of evidence that in fact partnership is in many ways required. And if you look at the experiences of the places around the world that have decreased urban violence in the most spectacular ways over the last several decades, be it Medellin, be it Ciudad Juarez or Sao Paulo, or some cities in the US, and so on and so forth. Virtually always you'll have a component of partnership there, particularly between city governments, law enforcement, and civil society organizations. And so I think, and there's this meta-analysis from the USAID in, I think, 2016 that kind of talks about the 6 pillars of what we know works in the reduction of urban violence, and one of those 6 pillars is in fact partnership. So I think there's a fair amount of evidence to base that on. I would also say that's very important that partnership be symbiotic in a way, that there are mutual benefits for all those involved. So it's a give and take, that you're bringing something to the table, you're taking something from the table. I would argue that it's important that partnerships be uncomfortable, which might sound a bit odd at first, but what I mean by that is that first, that they entail sacrifice. You have to, as the famous British political philosophers Keith Richards and Mick Jagger said, you can't always get what you want, and this is very true for partnerships. But et cetera, you can get what you need if you realize that you won't be getting 100% of your priorities, then that you have to kind of leave space for the priorities of others to come in as well. And I think it needs to be uncomfortable also in the sense that it needs to be done with organizations or people that are not like you, that are diverse, that see the world in a very different way, perhaps, that bring different perspectives, that can see through some of your blind spots as an organization or as experts. And have obviously different abilities, different knowledge, different networks, and so the complementarity of it is essential. And then just a couple more things for this initial response, that the partnership, really very important, I think, aspect is for it to be transparent and honest. And so I think communication amongst all the partners is very important. I think one of the places of trouble that we can speak of later, but that when partnerships don't go as hoped, it's often a lack of a very initial but often difficult conversation about what an organization's red lines are, what their utmost priorities are, what certain things that can't be transposed. They often kind of come to a very tense place at an end of a policy or a political process. And then I would say also that it's important that partnerships be very focused, so that they be very specific, they be perhaps time bound, they be that there's a temporality to it and a specificity to them that's very important, to really kind of hone down and focus, kind of a laser-like focus on what, if it's gender-based violence in a specific territory, if it's homicide reduction, that it be very specific and therefore and bring the best possible policies and evidence base to deal with that, but not to allow it to kind of grow into an amorphous everything is everything and we're trying to tackle everything at once, because I think there's kind of mission creep in partnerships there. I think I'll stop there for my initial. I think I've said too much as an initial introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I think you've raised some really, really powerful and important points. I mean, we have an exercise at Fix that we call what's negotiable and what's not negotiable. And that's where all partnership conversations have to start, in our view. That's the red lines. Where can we compromise and where can we not compromise? And I think that that's really just such an important, I think also part of what you're talking about is that in environments where we do take partnership for granted, we often don't spend the time thinking about partnership itself as an objective or investing time and energy in the relationship. We often, I think, we think we're partnering when we're just sitting around a table with people. We're like, okay, we can check that box. We've achieved that. But actually, you're raising some of the complexities and some of the granularity that we really need to engage with. I just see there's a comment from Barbara here where she says formality, and this was about MOUs, Elizabeth. Formality often creates hierarchies that are hard to penetrate. And so finding a balance is so important. And I think that's also about being really specific, Daniel, about what you're trying to achieve, how you can ensure inclusion of diverse voices, and what kind of commitments and compromises you're willing to make. So, Alex, I know you were also talking about the reasons that we partner or the incentives for partnership that can sometimes kind of derail some of what we might be able to achieve with partnership.
Yes, Emma, thank you. Thank you for the invitation as well. Very excited to share some ideas about this topic. And let me just tell a little bit about where I'm coming from. And I've been very privileged to have had the opportunity to co-develop a number of projects and initiatives to undertake participatory and action-oriented research in Latin America that have been most affected by the crisis of violence and insecurity in the region. And the kind of initiatives that we have been able to undertake in the last 10 years include, for example, projects that aim at producing local security agendas with residents of communities that are highly affected by violence. We have done that in Medellin, in particular neighborhoods of Medellin, in other 4 cities in Mexico, in Tegucigalpa. We have also done projects to work with different actors to analyze community responses to strategies to build safer cities and safer spaces for women and young people in these spaces. So I'm reflecting a little bit about this type of projects and initiatives that came about as a result of partnerships and collaborations that brought together very different actors. So it brought together academics from different countries in the north and in the south, and from different fields of knowledge. It also brought civil society organizations, various different areas. So we had NGOs working on human rights, on local development, on supporting victims of violence, but we also work with grassroots organizations and more organic kind of forms of organization in communities, youth groups, women's groups, and even citizens collectives, not really kind of formally organized groups in communities, and also with just residents who wanted to participate in processes of improving the situation in their communities and were able to participate in these projects as community researchers. So the kind of partnerships that we were working on were very diverse actors with very different kind of institutional capacities, different interests, and different areas of influence. And the first kind of, I was reflecting on what were the motivations, what brought us together, all these kind of diverse actors. I think I would say at least 3 things. I mean, one was the idea that by partnering and by working together, we could have a better understanding of the local dynamics of insecurity and violence that was affecting their communities. So we had this notion that we needed a more integral understanding of this problem, and that integral understanding can only be built with people with different points of view. with people with different frameworks, seeing the problem from different perspectives. So that was an incentive. All of us wanted to kind of bring our own points of view to build a better understanding of this challenge. The second kind of motivation was that we wanted to understand and make more visible what urban safety meant and entailed for different groups. So it was interesting for us to work with young people in marginalized communities, so for LGTB plus groups and groups of victims of internal displacement, because we wanted to understand how different people were experiencing these community problems that so often are talked about in a very general kind of way. So we could get a better, more complex and more gendered understanding of these challenges. And the third kind of objective, we wanted to think about and identify what can be done and who needs to be doing what. So with these kind of three things in mind, let's say we kind of embarked on these projects and these ideas and collaborations that were not always easy, but I'm going to try to highlight the kind of at least 6 things that I think they were present in the type of partnerships and collaborations that work for us. And the first thing we had a shared vision of the challenge, of the problems that we were facing and these communities were facing, and also a common understanding of what we would like to achieve. And in our context, and for our partnerships and collaborations, this common shared vision was an idea, a kind of people-centered notion of security, that we were interested in finding ways of improving security provision in a way that did not reproduce violences in this context, but also led to the protection of people's rights, including the right that people had to participate in transforming their own realities. So that was kind of the shared vision that allowed us to have what I think is the second important element of a successful partnership, and I think Daniel kind of mentioned it, is to have a clear and collectively defined objective. So we had defined specific objectives for specific initiatives that were in line with this vision, but still we had some flexibility. There was always room for uncertainty. So what I mean by that is that we not always knew from the beginning exactly how these objectives will materialize. And that led obviously to us having to accept some level of uncertainty. But also it enabled creativity. It allowed us to kind of on the way and by everybody's inputs, with young artists participating and thinking how we can make this knowledge relevant to people and policymakers and community organizations. We were creating, new ways of sharing this knowledge and making it, a kind of source of positive transformation in these communities. So some women in Tegucigalpa, when we have our local agendas of human security, for example, they decided they wanted to create these cabildos, or these like public meetings, to bring municipal officials to share this themselves without the academics kind of leading on this process. And that was kind of part of like how in Tegucigalpa, that was the best strategy to make these objectives accomplished. But it was different in Michoacan, in Mexico. There was the idea of maybe creating a network, an observatory of human security, for example. So there was this kind of room for creativity, for doing things in a different way and actually materializing those objectives in different ways than we had not expected in the beginning. The third element, it was something that you, Emma, mentioned as well, is that strengthening our relationship and finding new ways of working together was one of the objectives of our partnerships. So we were very interested not just in producing local agendas of human security, for example, with the communities, but we were also interested in having our institution developing new ways of interacting with other actors. So how our universities could establish new ways of interacting and relating with community leaders or members of civil society organizations that want to participate in academic projects, for example. So by working not only on trying to achieve those objectives, but also making the strengthening of our relations, institutional relations, and objective, we were able to work on those relations. The fourth element, and I think this was the most difficult one, was establishing horizontal relations. Obviously, when you have very diverse actors, you had academics from, again, different fields, different countries. You have members of different grassroots organizations, civil society organizations. You have obviously very different types of knowledge. So one way of establishing horizontal relations was encouraging everyone to recognize the value of different ways of doing things and different types of knowledge. And obviously acknowledging the power relations that were played out inside our groups. And we were open about this, who has the money, who is managing the budget, who has access to certain spaces. So being open about these power relations and trying to think how we address those relations in a way that did not damage our relationships was very important to kind of create that horizontal. But again, it was one of the most difficult things to do and not always work. Another element that I will say is important is that we, again, given the diversity of actors involved in these partnerships, we needed to think about different ways of engagement and different levels of engagement, again, so that we could be inclusive, but not everybody was not forced to do exactly the same thing. Everybody, every institution could bring in their own strengths, their own way of doing things to the process. And participate without being forced to do things that they are not having the capacity to do or not the interest. So we would, for example, create subcommissions and identify within our strategies how we can create subgroups with specific responsibilities and tasks that will be supportive of the strategy and the objectives we want to achieve, and create very good communication strategies so that we all know what everybody's doing and making sure that what every subcommission or team that has been allocated for a specific task, it's mutually reinforcing. It's everybody's working towards the same objective, just targeting different kind of areas and tasks. And the last point, and I will finish here, is that again, and it's something that Daniel mentioned, is that the outcomes of the partnership needed to be valuable to all partners. And again, these power relationships are really important to acknowledge from the beginning, because sometimes how we design what are the outcomes of this partnership are influenced by who has the power to decide. And we needed to, in our case, for example, we had academics who obviously would privilege producing academic articles or academic prose to contribute to academic debates, but academic articles mean nothing to a community leader or a little grassroots organization who wants to advance their own agenda. So we needed to think about the knowledge of the outputs and the formats, the different uses, the different audiences that we wanted to target with this initiative, so that we could produce outcomes that will be valuable and usable for all the different actors and audiences that we were interacting with.
Sure. Thanks so much, Alex. I mean, there's a couple of things that I just want to quickly pick up on. The first one is the issue of the shared vision. And we had a chat the other day where you were saying, we really need to think about incentivizing partnership financially, because especially NGOs and grassroots organizations, when there's money available, people will kind of have to try and fit themselves into the kind of the mandate or the project or the program that's been structured where the funds are on offer. And that's not the same thing as being motivated by a shared vision. And it's not the same thing as being motivated by shared value, by the idea that I will achieve something that I'm trying to achieve and you will achieve something that you're trying to achieve. The other thing that I really liked about what you said about the hierarchies is Barbara, my partner, always says money is a thing. It's not the thing. So very often the person who is we always say the person who is the treasurer shouldn't also be the chairman, because there is this problem which really undermines the ability to build horizontal relationships, which is that very often the person in control of the money is also the person in control of the decisions, which makes it much more difficult, for example, if you're a grassroots organization, to ensure that you are getting what you need out of it, because there is this kind of financial background transaction that's taking place. It also makes it much more difficult to ask your partners to compromise. And I love the fact that both you and Daniel have spoken about discomfort, uncertainty, and compromise, which I think very often, especially the funder, especially the person who's initiating this process, is saying, well, I'm not the one who has to be uncomfortable. I can be the one who's handing out the money. And the other thing that we always say is that it's very disempowering to always be on the receiving end. That if a relationship is structured in such a way that money is the most important factor or aspect in the relationship, there's always going to be a benefactor and there's always going to be a beneficiary. And that's not that's disempowering, firstly, for the so-called beneficiaries, but it's also silencing. It means that there isn't that idea of mutual benefit, which is really, really what we're trying to achieve through partnership, I think, is I get what I need and you get what you need. So I really thank you so much for that input. I think your projects sound really fascinating and exciting. And the other thing that I just want to touch on quickly is the issue of communications. It's something that we've been thinking about so much during COVID, is the fact that the way that we communicate impacts our ability to achieve almost everything that we're doing. Communication, different types of cultures and different types of organizations, as you mentioned, Daniel, they also impact communication. But even stress and trauma impact communication. You know, we're all really at the end of our tethers here with COVID, and our ability to be to compromise, our ability to have compassion, our ability to deal with uncertainty is really diminished. And I think that that's something that really bears further exploration. So these words, discomfort, uncertainty, compromise, creativity. Janice, you shared some really powerful insights with me around what are the pieces that as people we need to kind of take into account as we're going into a partnership process. And you were also talking about compassion, which I just felt was something that is so rarely mentioned in these conversations, but can have such a powerful impact.
Thank you, Emma, and it's so good to be here with everyone. I'm just going to mention that when I first started hopping on early morning calls with Barbara, she would be like, "Oh, there's lovely birds in the background. If you do hear it, they're actually little frogs that jumped on plants from Puerto Rico and have just thrived here in Hawaii. They're very loud." Yeah, so if I can just share a little bit about Hawaii. We are on part of an archipelago, and the island that I reside on is actually the island of Hawaii. It's about 4,000 square miles. We have about 200,000 folks on our island. Our area median income is about $89,000 for a family of 4. On our island, 61% of households do not meet the minimum threshold of a survival budget, which means they have enough income to cover 5 basic living expenses of housing, food, medical, childcare, and transportation. And so that was a huge concern for us to see how that number was increasing in its trajectory year upon year. And we came together to bring our community together around that. What surprised us when we brought folks together was immediately we began to understand that this measure that was being, this evaluation that was being given to us in this report was not completely authentically capturing the experience of our community. And we became aware of that when we would hear from people, you know, we might be the worst when it comes to income, but we're the best when it comes to family. And none of us are making it on our own, and all of us are making it because of family. We learned this when we brought 200 folks together from across our island in different districts and in different disciplines and different sectors, representing government, philanthropy, education, social services, our faith leaders, and people representing community. Brought them all together, and we said, we gave them literally 10 beams. And we said, with these 10 beams that you have in your vision of our most vibrant Hawaii, how do you invest your beams across financial capital, social capital, human capital, and natural capital? And we literally had them put their beams into buckets. And we said, now that's your vision. Now in your life today in reality, how do you invest your beams? And they invested it again. And then I said, and in the sector that you're here representing, how do you see your sector investing their beams? And what we found in these 3 simple questions in this exercise is that what was most important across sectors, across how people were coming and identifying themselves in their careers and in their jobs and in their industry, was that financial capital was not the most important thing. Our social capital, our relationships that we have with one another was the most important thing always. Our human capital our knowledge, skills, and abilities, and what we feel like we're able to contribute in a meaningful way to the system of community was the most important thing. And so then we became aware that we need to be radically different in the way that we approach our community. They're saying something really powerful to us. And what we decided at that point was around this word of innovation, because we're always being challenged to be innovative. And we said, what is the most innovative thing we can do as a colonized community after 100 years of colonization is to stop measuring ourselves and evaluating our success on what someone else is telling us what it is. What if the most innovative thing we can do is return to being who we are as island people? And so one of the first things that we changed in our language, because we are voyaging people, we would often hear of partnerships. We all just need to be in the same canoe, paddling together. And so our radically different way of thinking about it and speaking about partnership was stay in your own canoe. Everyone must stay in their own canoe and be excellent at what they are called to do, but we can travel together toward a common vision. And that permission right there, so much easier for people to come to the table because they felt like I can contribute what I'm good at. I don't have to jump into your canoe and pretend to know something that I don't, pretend to be an expert of something that I'm not, pretend to be able to contribute in a way that I can't. I can stay where I'm supposed to be and be excellent at what I'm called to do. So I think that was something, that permission right there made it really easy for people to come to the table. The second thing that we were really, that was a pivot and a transformation for us in our thinking, because we were, like most communities, focused on systems change. And sometimes systems change can be very daunting of a conversation to approach. And we were looking at an image of equality and equity. And I'm sure most folks are familiar with this. There's the fence, and it says equality, and there's people of different heights trying to see over the fence. And they say equality is giving everyone the same size box, whether you need it or you don't. And sometimes even with the same size box, you still can't see over the fence. And then the second image talks about equity, where everyone gets a different size box so that they can. And this one that we were looking at had a third image, and it was called justice. And in that third image, the wooden fence had been removed and it had been replaced with a chain link fence. And the barrier that was preventing folks from being able to engage with the baseball game and to see what was happening, the barrier was removed. And we were having a conversation about this, and someone in our leadership team said, she was supercharged, and she was like, yeah, burn the fence. And we all got behind her, we were like, yeah, burn the fence. And then she stopped and she was just quiet. She goes, oh my God, we are the fence. And there was this hush that came over the room, and we were like, yeah, we are the fence. And I think that awareness of, yes, it's a system, but we all contribute individually to that system was powerful and empowering, because we realized that if we change ourselves, we ultimately change the system. And that's the approach that we've taken. And so from there, we started to think about, well, how do we individually, how do we really genuinely change things within ourselves that then impact an entire system? And there's a paper called The Waters of Systems Change. And it looks like an inverted triangle. And at the top level, it talks about policy, practice, and resource flows. And it says in this paper, oftentimes when groups come together to shift systems, that's where all the focus and energy goes. Change policy, change legislation, get a grant, right? The middle part of the triangle talks about relationships and power dynamics. And that's where we look at operating in silos and building relationships and partnerships. And sometimes efforts go there and are very successful. But very rarely, this paper says, do folks focus on the bottom tip of the triangle. And that's where the mental models lie, what we believe to be true, the biases and assumptions that we have about each other. And so Vibrant Hawaii decided very early on that we would focus a lot of our energies and a lot of our time on mental models and challenging biases and assumptions. allowing ourselves to become aware of our own assumptions and what we believe to be true about our community and about each other. We're very fortunate that our native intelligence, our ancestors, have provided us a pathway towards that. There's a wise saying that says, "Eho iko piko," return to the source. In our native thought, we have 3 piko. We have 3 sources. The first one is up at our fontanelle when we're babies, and it's that soft spot on the top of our head. It connects us to our ancestors. It connects us spiritually to each other. It's where words like intuition and inspiration come from. It's when you're having that moment with someone and they say something and you're like, I was just about to say that. I was thinking that same thing. That is our Piko E. That is that connection that we have. And we say that when it becomes blocked, we operate with, we begin to say things like, we operate with judgment, and we begin to say things like, they should just, those people, they should just do this. And especially around conversations with poverty, it's very easy to come together with those kinds of words. And so immediately we began to call that out to each other and resolve to, rather than saying that, to operate with curiosity and to carve that path with curiosity. Our second Piko, our second connection that we have is our umbilical cord that connects us to our mothers. When we're growing in their bellies, it connects us to our ancestors. It connects us to each other here. It says when our Piko always blocks, we're operating with cynicism, and that's us versus them. And we get into those silos. And so the way that we unblock it is to carve out a path with compassion. And our third Piko is our area of reproduction. It connects us to our future. It connects us to creativity. It's our Piko A. When that is blocked, we are operating with fear. And the way that we unblock it is to suspend fear and carve out a path with courage. And so I think with our resolve to continually look both to be inspired by our Aina, who is our land, who is our ancestor, who has raised us for generations and generations, to look at biomimicry and the ways that our land practices courage, compassion, collaboration, partnership, and then to always remember the genius that has been passed down in our DNA from our ancestors, and the way that we know to be with one another has really helped to move our work forward. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Janice. I mean, Toby, I don't know if you could bring our little slide up again. I love the way that you're talking about kind of personal choices that people have to make. And it's actually not just choices, it's also challenging yourself to be courageous, to be curious, to be compassionate. And I think that in our kind of draft of this slide, you can see that we've also got courage and creativity there. And we're also talking about co-creation and resilience. And in fact, we're suggesting that without having that kind of reflection on how you as an individual are part of this process and what kind of investment it's going to take from you, and again, not financial investment, but personal investment, the ability. I love the Brené Brown quote when she says, I'm here to get it right, not be right. And that's actually a really, really difficult thing to do, to trust people around you enough to say, okay, I'm going to be courageous enough to build that trust, to be curious about what people really mean, to be compassionate about why they're saying what they're saying, and then to try and find a way to build a partnership that's based on those things. And as I say, I mean, our slide also right at the top there, linked to courage and creativity, is innovations, high expectations of each other. And we had a really interesting conversation the other day about the idea of it being safe to fail as well, that certainly in South Africa, the idea of failure is very, very uncomfortable. we can't really talk about failure, and we have quite a sort of punitive environment where if things go wrong, there's a lot of blame. And so, firstly, we can't really admit when things are going wrong because it's not safe. And secondly, that really removes the opportunity to learn from that. But learning from that, I think, as you say, that link to courage and competence is so powerful. And it's really interesting kind of in the context of, I mean, Elizabeth, thinking about what you were saying about how people do it because they have to, but sometimes they actually believe that if they weren't having consultation, they could be spending their time and energy solving the problem on their own. And that really is, I think, a personal shift that's required. So thanks, Toby. You can take that down again. I think Barbara has a comment that she would like to make.
Sorry, our unmute system is more complicated because we're sitting in the same place, which Janice knows well about us. Yeah, and I wanted to start by saying that something that Janice has really taught us, working with Janice, is something that I want to link back to what Daniel was saying. And that is how important words and language are. And part of partnership, I think, that is often missed is having a shared understanding of the words that we use and thinking very deeply about the words that we use. So Daniel, you talked about USAID having 9 pillars. And whenever I hear about pillars in strategies that are systemic, I think, why do we use the word pillars? Because if you integrate pillars, you get a wall. And what we really need to be doing is to be seeing things in a way that is more porous, and that makes it possible for us to actually slip through into each other's themes and sectors and cast a sectoral lens on each other's work, which is when I think the magic starts to happen. And so for me, that issue of language and the words that we use is a hugely important part of partnership. And the other thing that you said, Daniel, that really sparked a thought for me was about sticking to a clear focus. And for me, that is really important. You said it shouldn't become an amorphous mess. And I think that's really important within the context that there is no simple solution to a complex problem. So, for instance, if you talk about focusing on gender-based violence, there's no one simple solution to gender-based violence. You have to be able to embrace the complexity. And the only way to embrace the complexity is through partnership. And so it comes back to also, I think, what both Elizabeth and Alex referred to, which is about the intentions of partnership. What motivates partnership and what keeps it going? And I think that the only thing that keeps it going is when we understand that there is a mutual benefit in working together. And the only time that is possible is when we are very sure that what we're aiming to do is more complex than that we can do on our own, and that other people bring bits to that. And so I think there's a real art to being able to embrace complexity without taking on everything. It should never be everything, but there should be an acknowledgement that the reason that we work together is that there is enough complexity for us to each be useful and valuable in that complexity. And certainly we've seen that working with Vibrant Hawaii. We have seen that making of that usefulness that people recognize in themselves and the way that they can actually integrate that by working with others. And I think it's a very powerful example. So thanks, Ben.
Can I just, we were really challenged by Barbara, and we were referring to our work as pillars in the beginning, because that's what you do. And we had 5 of them: economy, education, housing, universal themes of what represented our vibrant Hawaii. And she was like, oh, it's interesting you're using this word pillar. And so we went back and had a thought about it, and have since began to refer to our work as streams. And so we picked streams because streams emerge from a common source. Streams are responsive to their environment, and in that response of the environment, sometimes they flow together and they come together in confluence. And then in response to the changing environment, they flow apart. Sometimes little streams come from one stream, and we've definitely seen that in our work. And that fluidity, again, inspired by our land and what we see all around us in what works and what is effective to carve out new paths forward, has been really powerful imagery for us to continue to reflect on. So thank you, Barbara, for that.
I love the idea of, of thinking seriously about streams. I mean, the way that you describe what streams really means is such an apt kind of organic description of what we're trying to achieve with partnerships. So I thank you both for kind of getting us to think about the specifics when it comes to the words that we use. I mean, I think, Elizabeth, this kind of links to the question that you started with earlier, and I don't know if you have a comment on this, but it seems as though a lot of what we're talking about here is around balance. So it's kind of trying to balance formal commitments with action. It's trying to balance power in a horizontal way. It's trying to balance being uncomfortable with achieving what you need to achieve. It's trying to balance kind of structural and power inequalities and hierarchies. And it's also, from this discussion, it's also kind of about balancing your professional objectives and your kind of personal ability to engage and participate.
Yeah, I thank you, Emma. I did. It's exactly on this last point that I wanted to react because I'm just fascinated by the conversation and fascinated on a personal level. I've worked in an international environment at some points, and now on a very international, but also mostly EU based, mostly working with local and regional authorities, where the ability to talk about their people's personal commitment, let alone their feelings, is absolutely non-existent and not recognized and not valued. So there's a huge discrepancy, which I think is so interesting, between what some of the previous speakers have shared, including what Janice has shared, and what sort of the going vernacular and sort of habits of European cities are working with today. I think a lot, and this is why, which is really fascinating to me, because I think, and I think it's, in this case, it's us as European cities that are very sophisticated in many levels, but have a lot to learn from these other experiences around this virtual panel. Meaning that I think a lot of people, and this is what I was also trying to say earlier, I think a lot of people, a lot of the stakeholders within a partnership, if you take any local crime prevention partnership, local safety partnerships in a European city, most individuals will hide behind their suit, will hide behind their institutions, will say, no, this has nothing to do with me, Elizabeth, or me, Paul, or Peter. I'm just representing my institution. This is what the official, Justice Department, Transport Authority, education system has to say. Oh, and at the coffee break, they might say, I'm sorry, we can't do much more, or I'm sorry, I can't commit. But basically, I'm hiding behind my institution. So connecting sort of the person and the position, the person with, all the sort of aspects of personal courage that we talked about, or compassion or personal understanding with their institutional behavior, is something that's absolutely not connected in the environment that I'm working in. So that's, first of all, that's sort of just a sharing and my experience or where we stand at right now, but also an invitation maybe to share, for all of you to share maybe very concrete methods also to bring out that that connection between the institution and the person and the personal positioning, and I think obviously there are probably ways to moderate that. I don't know, techniques and role playing and this and that to help people get out of that institutional posture, but also, and maybe also for other environments to see the experience that I'm sharing as a warning of the risk of over formalizing partnerships. And I don't want to sound, I know I'm sounding super negative right now on what's going on in our cities. And obviously it's not, and the good news is that there are a lot of benefits to having these institutional partnerships, but there is a lack of individual and personal connection and involvement and accountability at the end of the day, maybe.
One of the first exercises that we did, I apologize, Alex, I just jumped right in. One of the first exercises we did when we brought those 200 folks together, it was called Stand Up for Someone. And this is how we were introducing this idea of mental health, which was a big thing. And we handed out sheets of paper, and there were 10 questions on it. The first 5 were around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And the second half was around BCEs, benevolent childhood experiences. And we had folks check off the box if it was true for them. Prior to below the age of 18, did someone in your household commit suicide? Prior to the age of 18, was someone in your household abusing drugs or alcohol? Did you experience divorce? Were you often hungry as a child? And then the benevolent childhood experience markers were, did you have at least one person that you could trust? Did you have a neighbor? Did you have a friend? And these are like scientific markers that are being studied. And then we had folks in the room, and remember, we had government officials and faith leaders and social service leaders, educators, all in the room, filling out this sheet of paper. We had them fold it up and pass it until no one knew whose paper they had anymore. And then we read it off one by one, and we said, if it's true, it's marked as true on your paper, stand up. And people in the room could not believe how many folks stood up for the different ACEs. And likewise overwhelmed when we read out the benevolent experiences, and to see the goodness in our community that was also present. And I think that that shared lived experience in that moment of, we're not talking about those people out there. We're really talking about us. That gave us a foundation to move forward and build upon conversations with that awareness that as we approach these conversations, as we talk about problems and solutions, it's very personal. We're talking about you. We're talking about the experience that you have about your children having to move away from Hawaii because they can't afford to live here anymore. And that pain that you feel as a parent beyond what your title and your role is, and your position and your privilege and authority within the system. There is something very personal. And that's the way that we come to the table and have conversations with each other.
Thank you, Janice. Alex, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes, it was in the same line of Janice's experience, and something that I think is very important from what Elizabeth said is our kind of ability to relate to the type of work we do, at a personal level. And we did exactly, a very similar type of exercise at the beginning of some of our initiatives, when we were actually bringing all the team together and then telling ourselves, well, we are in learning about how people are experiencing violence, traumatic experiences, insecurity. Are we willing to talk about these things at a personal level? So we did almost kind of like a ritual at the beginning. Everybody in the team, academics who, a criminologist who looks at this, from a very kind of scientific and, objective perspective, and many other actors. But just to highlight this kind of like the most rational kind of academy, let's say, we'll have in the team, we will ask what are the kind of personal experiences, for example, that we had in relation to insecurity or in relation to violence. And all of us had actually personal, very deeply, and some of us even traumatic experiences with violence and insecurity, kidnappings, all sorts of things. But even just that moment at the beginning of the process allowed us to recognize that we as humans also had a position, had feelings about problems. And this was not just a job, right? This was not just a project. This was something that passed through our bodies, passed through our emotions, our states, and affects us at a personal level as well. And by bringing that, not only that awareness, it brings a different perspective of the type of work we were doing, but also it allows us to, develop this empathy about how are we going to do this job with the people on the ground. So I think that was a very interesting learning for us. And the other type of ritual we did, which I think is more related to the partnership and the success of the partnership, is this question. In another ritual, we talk about the things we need to unlearn and the things that we would like to learn. And I think this was important because for us, or the partnerships that work for us, were about questioning the assumptions we have about things. In the same way that Janice talked about being able to question about what we understand from justice, what role do we play in these problems, social problems. So for us as well, this idea that we were in these partnerships to learn from others, and that takes courage because it challenges your ego, it challenges the way that you have been doing, understanding, and talking about things. But so the idea that it was okay to unlearn things and challenge our own assumptions was a very powerful thing as well for us in the process. So I think that is an important point. How do we bring us as humans and as people with experiences and local histories and personal histories to this process to make this partnership work is very important. Thank you.
Emma, I think Anna wants to say
Anna,
something.
yes. I was just going to say that's Toby. Thanks, Toby. Anna?
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, thank you. This is a fascinating discussion. I just wanted to ask the panelists, in particular Daniel, but also you, Emma, about this apparent contradiction. In this chart that you were showing, there is a process that goes from this very negative and passive approach to creativity and innovation, etc. In the middle, there is resilience, and resilience is now a concept that not only has been accepted, but it's something that now is perceived as desirable in a community. It's something that basically even people who didn't know what it meant a few years ago now accept the resilience very easily and know more or less what it's all about. So how do we go in the direction of courage and creativity, and how do we make people who have accepted without blinking an eye very aspirational goals? Imagine the Sustainable Development Goals. No? The Sustainable Development Goals, they have been adopted by consensus by the international community. They are clearly aspirational. There are some things that, 2030, significant reduction of illicit arms flows, for example, or elimination of violence against women and things like that. And the Pathfinders, Daniel, your objective, you have a group of stakeholders that are seriously engaged in halving violent deaths, basically, by 2030. So how do you go beyond and really have the creativity to implement something concrete, so something that goes beyond this commitment that then doesn't translate into something that is really operational? Thank you.
Daniel, I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Sure. Thank you, Anna. I mean, I think that's an excellent point. I think the kind of the contrast between the aspirational and the operational aspect of things is, in fact, quite a stark contrast when we get down to the reality of the numbers and so on and so forth. I think, you know, one of the ways to tackle this discrepancy, as you have correctly posited, is not to do things like we've always done. So I think, you know, just continuing down the same roads with the same partners, using the same methodologies, and, you know, perhaps as Barbara has pointed out, using the same language and the same assumptions and the same actors is unlikely to kind of bridge that gap that you have identified. So I think one of the things is precisely to kind of, you know, as much as it is a cliche, to kind of attempt a bit to step back, to get out of the box, perhaps to make the tent broader than it has been to date in many of these discussions, and that would include bringing in the possibility of, you know, actors that haven't had a voice, populations that haven't been represented. You know, that can be youth voices, that can be more attention to issues of gender. You know, a more kind of diverse group of experts and organizations. And I think perhaps the second point is something that I think that Emma had spoken to before, which is this, you know, this openness to innovation and risk, and the understanding that you can't do this in an assured manner. You can't bank on the result. And if you're going to try to do something really different than what's been done before, you're going to have to take some risks. You're going to have to, you know, innovate, and that, again, maybe includes new actors, new methodologies, new languages, a new culture of tackling things, and really attempt to kind of just not follow the status quo, not follow, you know, perhaps some of the paths that have been presented to us, but rather, and that, you know, there's an obvious pun with my organization being the Pathfinders, but, you know, sometimes to find said path, you might need a machete, and you might need to walk through the woods. That path is not there. It hasn't been done for you before. All of this, of course, is very difficult. I think it depends on a lot of collaboration, a lot of partnership. I think really partnership for that kind of attempt is crucial. And, you know, it's also very fair to say that it's, you know, in process terms, kind of for us at least, a beginning of a process that has a very long road in front of us. And, you know, how well we'll be able to do these things, I think also, again, depends on support from diverse actors and people and organizations that are you know, hoping to do something a little bit different than perhaps has been done in the past. And being open to attempt, and being open to failure. And I mean, failure is only failure if you don't learn anything from it, right? I mean, if you fail and you learn and you know, well, I'm not going down this road again. It told us that we need to do this in this other direction, in this other way, then that's part of the process as well. So I'm not sure I entirely answered your question, but I tried.
You're bravely heading out into the wilderness with your machete, Daniel. Thank you very much. There's kind of a theme that's emerging for me, which I think is quite interesting, is this idea of diversity and inclusion. It's really interesting that some of what we're talking about really echoes some of the global movements around vulnerability, exclusion, and marginalization. Black Lives Matter and Me Too, gender-based programs, and it's really interesting that we're kind of saying more and more that the way this conversation is unfolding is you kind of need to acknowledge, you need to include who you regard as the quote-unquote other. You need to have enough self-awareness to be able to understand that that person or that group or institution or organization is kind of structurally and culturally positioned in relation to you as an other. And then you have to have the curiosity, the courage, and the compassion to say, well, what kind of language exploit, oppress, silence, marginalize? And I think that's really interesting that, our conversation is really about a kind of a professional practice, but we're coming really close to some of the really fundamental principled issues that we're dealing with in the world, and we're also dealing with in South Africa at the moment. But so it kind of links to a question that I wanted to ask you, Daniel. I'm sorry to come straight back to you, but we had an experience on a partnership which really fell apart precisely because of the issues that we're talking about here, where partners misunderstood each other. And because we hadn't had the conversation, although we had tried up front to say, look, when it's difficult, let's talk about the fact that it's difficult. And because we were such diverse groups, that people's experiences of others' ways of communicating and ways of being was really alienating. And it resulted in the complete dismantling and falling apart of a huge 5-year, really, well-funded, well-supported, diverse, inclusive, powerful program, because we weren't able to understand the ways that we were different, understand the ways that our expectations were different, to understand the ways that we were othering each other. And then we weren't able to have the conversation about why that was uncomfortable. And that was a really powerful lesson for us around being very explicit right up front about what our different expectations are. It's the red lines that you talked about earlier as well, Daniel, the ways that we're different. So I think that diversity issue has been the cause for us of a failure, of a tragic failure of a really sort of a powerful project which had real potential. And you were talking the other day, Daniel, about some other partners that you've experienced which have fallen apart. And I wonder if, we're saying here we have to be open to attempt, open to failure, and it's only a failure if we don't learn. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about some of the failures that we've experienced and what we might learn from them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I have a few thoughts about kind of why partnerships fail. And I think one of the main points is precisely what you have posited, Emma, which is kind of just, incompatible cultures. And I think you could talk about incompatible languages as well. Now, of course, you can do some work up front to minimize or reduce that. But I think it's important to recognize that perhaps there are some organizational cultures that are so discrepant that you are never really able to, in all honesty, find a shared vision and a shared language with. And so I think, in my experience, I think about some partnerships, for instance, in Latin America, in Brazil, particularly between civil society and law enforcement forces. Those are very difficult, of course. And in a lot of cases, I think certain civil society operating in a certain way and certain units or offices of law enforcement can indeed find that shared language and can speak in the same language. And I mean, that's possible and that's been done. But if we're talking about the failed attempts, I think, I've seen sometimes where the discrepancy in kind of the vision of the world and of what violence means, what it entails, why it's caused, and what you can do about it. If that shared diagnosis is so discrepant, and in Latin America, it's a very common, particularly a lot of law enforcement agencies and then political leadership have this notion of mano dura, right? The tight fist, that basically you defeat violence with violence, which couldn't be more contrary, I think, to the way many civil society groups see things, but also couldn't be more contrary to actual evidence of what works. And sometimes that conversation it's so ingrained, and that philosophy is so ingrained that you can never actually connect. Even if you try and you put the MOUs in place and the structures and the meetings and so on and so forth. So I mean, I think that's one way partnerships can fail. Another one I think is something that Alexandra was referring to before, which is basically the issue of power imbalances. And so and of course, when we're talking about horizontal organization, that's often very stark, but that can help. If we're talking about vertical partnerships, obviously, there's going to be an ingrained power imbalance, but I think that can be, it can be constructed in a way that's understood and everybody has their role. I think in horizontal partnerships, oftentimes, I've seen, unfortunately, but I think ultimately it's not an uncommon thing. You see the development of a lot of competition. You see the development of issues over kind of resources, particularly financial resources. So I think that Emma, you mentioned the importance of separating kind of the power of the purse to the microphone, or the power or the political power. I think that's a very good point, because I mean, I've seen some cases where one organization has held all of those and failed to kind of divest and share and communicate transparently, and because of that, a partnership has collapsed. Another aspect I think perhaps touches with some of the lessons that Janice was sharing, which is really the human component of it. It's really how much partnerships are kind of just organizational versions of human relationships, and how difficult human relations are, and how we try our best, and all of us are ultimately imperfect in them, and we struggle and we have trouble, and particularly in kind of the human aspect of it, I think I've seen a fair amount of what I'd call kind of leadership misplacement, perhaps. And so you would have a situation where a partnership would be the connecting kind of hubs of the partnership were perhaps the top boss of an organization, but that person is not the best person actually to fertilize and to play this very diplomatic role of networking and communication and contacting. So sometimes you have the most brilliant researcher, you have the most brilliant leader, and they're really bad at the basics of partnership, which I think as we've talked about have a lot to do with some very distinct kind of human and organizational characteristics that I think go back to transparency and courage and openness and communication, and some leaders are not, they're great at what they do, but they're not good at that. And so the people that are in charge of the kind of fertilizing or keeping the partnership going need to be people that are good at that, not necessarily the top person in an organization. And then a final aspect I would place in kind of some failed partnerships I think I've experienced, and obviously none of these are my fault. So I was just an observant, of course, and it's a coincidence if there's been more than one of them. Of course this is just kind of strategic and political shifts, things that are kind of come from the outward world that a small partnership or a group of individuals or whatnot has virtually no governance over, that kind of happen. And I imagine, for instance, the pandemic right now has been something that probably has thrown a lot of partnerships up in the air, and then some of them, back to issues of capacity and funding and so on and so forth. But clearly when, a shift like that happens, But a more common example, I think, in thinking of city governments and civil society partnerships and thinking about urban safety and urban violence reduction is, the discrepancy between the political cycle or the mandate, traditionally a 4-year or 5-year mandate of a leader, and the time where true transformation, particularly when it's based on prevention of violence, needs to really bear fruit. And sometimes the discrepancy between those two is too stark to allow a partnership to continue. And sometimes just very clearly, a change of a mayor will mean that a partnership is broken. A political pendulum to the other side of an issue, they no longer prioritize that. They no longer want to invest in it, and that's the end of a partnership. And so that's kind of a seismic shift that happens from the outside, which also, and I think perhaps going back to issues of resilience, thinking of resilience, what can be done to protect partnerships from these kind of outside impacts. But I think in reality, this is another reason why partnerships can fail as well.
Sure, thanks, Daniel. I think that is so useful. I mean, the first thing I just wanted to comment on is when you talked about relationships with law enforcement agencies. And I think one of the things that we're kind of trying to propose in this webinar series is that when you're thinking about urban safety, you shouldn't start with law enforcement. You really need to think about the system. You need to think about the diverse role players. And in fact, even maybe law enforcement should be your last port of call. Once you've got this kind of broad coalition of local city actors participating, that's when you can start to say, okay, so what is the mandate of law enforcement? Because certainly in South Africa, we place a huge emphasis on the role of law enforcement in achieving urban safety, which simply, firstly, isn't possible and isn't their mandate. And so I think that, that difficulty of partnering with law enforcement is such an important and powerful insight. And I mean, is it as simple as saying, like, these are the people who hold the guns. These are the people who have the military power. And if you're on the other side of a gun, it's not that easy to create, as you say, a horizontal relationship. There's two more things that I wanted to quickly comment on. The one is the issue of the political cycle and the long-term view. So certainly the long-term view is also something that we really want to advocate for here, which says in South Africa, we sort of propose that the horizon for seeing the impact of the change that you're trying to achieve is kind of 15 years. It's when the daughter of the pregnant 15-year-old girl is 15 herself, and she's still in school, and she's not dropping out of school because she's also pregnant, and she's not abusing substances or subject to vulnerability of, violence and abuse in the home and outside the home. So, yeah, I mean, 15 years, as you say, there's no politician that's really going to find it easy to buy into that. But that is also certainly something that I think that this webinar series is advocating for. Sorry, my computer keeps giving me a little bit of feedback. The last thing that I wanted to comment is people are often bad at the basics of partnerships. And I love the fact that you say, we're bad at it in our own lives too. Nobody's getting it right all the time. So it's not surprising that we're not getting it right with people that we don't know, environments which are sticky and difficult. But I think that the importance of leadership is absolutely fundamental to the resilience of organizations and the resilience of partnerships. And Janice, I was wondering, as the leader of a sort of a broad coalition grassroots organization, whether you could talk a little bit about leadership and whether there are some sort of fundamental principles that we could bear in mind around leadership.
Thank you. Well, I do want to share what I was thinking about as Daniel was speaking, and it comes back to safety and the safety within a group and safety amongst partners. We are leading a huge network of the emerging of a network of community resilience hubs funded by CARES right now. It came upon really suddenly. We were awarded over $1.5 million to expend within 12 weeks. And the way that we use that money is trusted our community to know what they need for themselves. And so we have people of very different levels of capacity when it comes to grant reporting and things like that. What they're really, really good at is knowing what their community needs. And so one of the things that I learned through this process is to call out where we're at in the process. And that even in just calling out and saying, we're in the storming phase, guys. We're going to get through it. This is normal. All groups that come together go through a storming phase. We're going to get to norming. And then once we start to see that glimmer of norming and knowing what it's like to submit weekly reports back to the government and what it's like to upload documents to Google Drive, then being able to say, we're getting there. We're in norming. Yes, we got there. But I think it's important to create, and it's not about necessarily calling out failure, but it's just normalizing that part of the process because it is so normal. And then to give that hope that we are getting to performing. We're getting to transforming, guys. The other thing that I wanted to share about partnerships, and especially with partnerships like government, one of the first things that happened in our work, we partnered with first responders. And what we asked them when they came to the table is, what do you need? What would be meaningful for you? And surprisingly, what they shared was, you know, it's National Dispatchers Week coming up, and our dispatchers are some of the most hardworking folks. They are literally front lines. Our lives depend on them as first responders. They hear all of this, and this year we don't have it in our budget to be able to recognize them and celebrate them, and it's really making us, I mean, it's so many words. They were sad about it. And so we're like, well, what can we do? We can get kids to make thank you cards, and we can buy like lunch. It was such a small investment, but it was like, this is what we can do. We can do this. And it meant so much for them that it opened the door to greater things. And I think one of the most important things that I've been reminded of is, you know, I grew up in the 90s with everything was go big or go home. And I've been challenged, like, go small, go really, really small. How small can you go? And I think that approach in building trust, because partnerships are all about trust and relationships, and like any relationship, trust is built incrementally in really small things that happen. That's been really not inspiring, that's been really comforting to see how we can do this in really small and genuine ways that lead up to really big things. I don't know if I answered your question at all about leadership, but that's what I was thinking when Daniel was talking.
Thank you, Janice. I think that's really lovely. I mean, just starting with your last piece there about going small, I think that links to the issue of having realistic objectives for your partnership. So that's another reason that they fail, is when we decide that we're going to do something that we haven't really figured whether or not it's possible, and we get, you know, 2/3 of the way into our budget or our time or our process, and we realize it's not possible. Things really fall apart, especially if, as we've said, we struggle with failure. So kind of thinking about what it's possible to achieve in the kind of systemic context that we start with, I think is a really powerful and valuable part of building relationships and partnerships that are more resilient. I think the other thing that I found really sort of useful about what you said was around, you know, the roles inside an organization. So Barbara and I work with an upside down leadership model that says the leader is at the bottom as opposed to usually on the top of the pyramid, sort of cascading things down upon all of these employees who carry these incredibly heavy burdens of these very heavy leaders at the top. So we say, all right, so the leaders are at the bottom and they have to support and enable people throughout the organization who are at the delivery interface, because that's the only place where leadership's effectiveness can really be measured, is at the delivery interface. And so it's the role of leaders to support and enable. Daniel, you were saying about, sometimes you've got the leader that you have in the room isn't the person who's going to be doing the implementation, isn't necessarily the person who has the right relationship with the project, doesn't have the knowledge or the insight or the materials, resources, time, capacity, etc. And so I think that it's lovely to think about leadership as a support role that says, okay, so sometimes I do need the CEO to pick up the phone and make the link for me. But what I need the CEO to say to the other CEO is, can you please get your operations person to speak to my operations person? Not the two of us are going to have a meeting, set objectives that are decontextualized from the work that's actually going to be done, shake hands in our suits and walk away, and set the people up in our organizations up to fail. So I think that those are two really, really useful insights. The last one that I just wanted to mention is also this idea that we're in the storming phase and that change is always difficult, and that it is the role of leaders to make it safe and to make it okay to be uncomfortable with change. Say, okay, guys, this is the intense period, or we've reached that moment of crisis in the partnership, and now's the time where we need to be creative and courageous about how we're going to make it last and how we're going to make it work. So I really think that those are very useful insights. Barbara, I see a comment for you. I don't know if you would rather prefer to just make the comment rather than have me read it out. Is that all right?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is just such a lovely conversation, and I wish there were more people listening to it. But hopefully, Tobias, you'll put it on YouTube, and many people will. But yeah, I think you're making this really fabulous insight that very often what people want is not more than is possible, it's less than is possible. And very often it's about people wanting to be useful and to have agency in the change that they want to see. It's not about waiting for someone to do something for them. It's about waiting for the opportunity to participate in making that change happen. And I think that's something that very often in hierarchies is missed. I mean, we always ask the question, what does it look like when it's fixed? And once, many years ago, somebody from our Department of Human Settlements said, well, what if what they tell you it looks like when it's fixed isn't what you're intending to do? And I said, well, I'm just going to leave a little gap in the conversation to answer the question for yourself. Wouldn't you rather know now than once you've spent the money? But, and so I think, and in South Africa, we have that all the time, that government in particular spends money on a massive scale, and it's not what people wanted. So I don't think you have to always give people what they say they want. I think you have to hear what they say you want. And then it's your job as a technician, as a facilitator, to go through a process of agreeing whether or not that's actually going to be the best outcome. But I mean, I just despair about how often it is that after that, to take us back to the beginning of this conversation, after a box ticking consultation process, people are then given or delivered services or infrastructure or support that is not what they actually want. So I just love what Janice is saying about people making their own decisions.
Computer muted. Thank you very much. It's lovely. You muted now. Okay. Sorry, guys. It's very easy to call a group of 90% of women guys. Sorry about that. There's a lovely quote here that Janice has shared with us from, I don't want to try and pronounce that name because I know I'm going to get it wrong. It's in the chat. Janice, I don't know if you could tell us, maybe you can give us the quote so that I don't embarrass myself.
It's from a philosopher named Lao Tzu. It's a leadership quote. A leader is best when people barely know he exists. When his work is done, his aim fulfilled, they will say we did it ourselves. I think that's a way that we approach our work at Vibrant Hawaii. And so even though so a lot of what we do is behind the scenes. And so even in that small example I gave with the dispatcher, our role was to coordinate the lunch, to coordinate everything. The one that handed it over to the dispatchers was their captain. When we work with community, we're behind the scenes, we're coordinating meals, coordinating transportation of things. The ones that put everything together on site and hand it off to their community is the community. And I think that's been also very key in the way that we, the role that we play, that then builds trust of our intention and that we're there to serve and we're there to lift you up to be able to do what you are called to do and what you're really good at.
Sure, I think that's so powerful, Janice. I think that also links very much to what Barbara's saying about people want to be useful, people want to be part of the process. But it also links, Alex, to something that you were talking about earlier, which is around the way that when we start with a shared vision, we have the opportunity to share the successes and we have the opportunity to achieve something that we all value. And I wondered, we've got 7 minutes left, but I just wondered if you had any comments that you wanted to make at this stage. Alex, we haven't heard from you for ages. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Thank you. I actually had, I was just thinking about one of the other type of limitations sometimes to the success partnerships. And I think one of the issues sometimes we forget is how high in the list of priorities for each institution that decides to participate, the actual existence of the partnership is, how important it becomes to their agenda. And I say that because sometimes we have, got involved in collaborations in which, people within an institution organization is very interested in participating, is very willing to give their time, their energy, but their organization, their institution is just nominally kind of interested in the partnership. It kind of sounds good, but it does not necessarily mean that the rest of the institution is going to be supportive to this person giving time, energy into making the participation in the partnership work. So something that is very important at the beginning, when we're setting up the partnership is to, have this conversation. Each organization needs to be clear about how much are they willing to commit in terms of resources, but also in terms of allowing their members of their team to actually give a lot of the energy. So something that is important, has been important for collaborations in our side, is when the partnership becomes part of their agenda. When the grassroots organization sees the partnership as something that can lead to advancing their own objectives, when obviously it's important for the research agenda of the research institution, when the community organization, even the youth group sees that maybe the young artists who are part of the process actually can gain or learn something from it, so they are interested in investing time in this. So just to say that on that issue. And in terms of engaging with state actors, we have had kind of difficult processes with trying to get, like I told you, we have been in the process of developing these local agendas, and the local agendas are basically participatory diagnosis of the problems a neighborhood or residents of a neighborhood identify, right? But also ideas of what can be done about it. And these proposals are thought in terms of what can the community do about these problems? What can civil society organizations do about these problems, and what kind of state institutions can do about this? And when we kind of set up the spaces for, interacting and sharing this knowledge with state actors, let's say we sit with the commander of the police of the local police station who is concerned with these problems in the neighborhood. What we see sometimes is, well, different things. Sometimes we see what Daniel mentioned, and is that, you know, these people, sometimes they are not really interested in changing their mindset or listening, you know, to how the community is perceiving, you know, the security problems, and or they feel, you know, that they have to defend their performance, their roles, right, and justify, you know, the way they are doing things and how they are investing resources, or why the police officers are stationed in a particular corner and not in the other one, where the women feel that they would be more useful to protect them, you know, from certain risks and this type of thing. So the way that you deal with that is sometimes it's within those institutions, there are a lot of diversity as well. So something that we forget as well, even within the police institutions, for example, that are the most challenging sometimes to kind of have this dialogue, is that there are various actors and there are some kind of small change actors within this institution. So sometimes in some of these communities you have the community police officers, or the police, the kind of street level police officers are in patrol, and some of them are really interested in doing things in a different way, and because they understand the you know, the limitations of the ways they are acting in the community, or because they actually have that pressure that Emma just realized. I have had police officers telling me, I mean, we know, but these problems of this community are so complex. It's about poverty, marginalization, young people don't have jobs. How can I solve this problem? But obviously what we are called to do is, you know, to solve the problem of violence and insecurity by, you know, patrolling the community or doing certain things. But what I'm trying to say is that sometimes you identify kind of like little actors, little in amount of people, not in importance. They're very important people, that there are actors within these institutions that are willing to listen. So one of the strategies that we use is try to identify within these institutions who are those kind of actors that might be, you know, ready to listen, and that they might actually need the support within their own institution to kind of scale up the conversation. And in that way, the partnership with these institutions kind of come up in a way that supports those people that do not have voice within their own institutions to maybe promote change or promote different ways of doing things. Sometimes you get lucky and then you get a good commander that is very open-minded and is very willing to listen. And then, you know, the opportunity kind of sparkles to be able to do things in a different way. But I mean, my call is just to, when we engage with state actors, is also try to see or try to identify the diversity within them, and trying to kind of see whether there are open spaces for listening. I mean, we have very different experiences even at the municipal level. For example, in Michoacán, like Daniel said, there was a change in the municipal, in the major change, and that changed a whole complete conversation with the municipal office in that city in the third year of our project. So, you know, there are kind of like serendipity as well, is something that we normally don't mention, but it definitely has an impact sometimes in the outcomes of the initiatives that partnerships are trying to deliver. And but it is that as readiness, as a collective, you know, when you are actually able to find a group of actors that are engaged and are convinced that there is a shared vision, sometimes you can, you know, have a long-term kind of partnership that might not deliver specific things for some time, but is ready to seize the opportunity. And that's another thing. Sometimes, you know, we work about, you know, and in the line of like small projects or small initiatives, sometimes those partnerships become latent for some time. Like this pandemic, for example, for some time it's difficult to get things done. We don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty, but then something, you know, happens, and then the magic of partnership is that when they're strong and they're ready, they just allow you to respond much quicker to seize any opportunity in the context that might emerge to kind of work towards the objectives that and the shared vision that you have.
Thank you. I love that. I love the idea that sometimes it depends on who the individual is. Daniel, I wonder if who are easier to work with are also the people that it's easier to live with at home. Look, it is 6 o'clock already. I wanted to just come back to you for a moment, Elizabeth, and hear if you had some final thoughts. Maybe I could ask you to do the closing. I don't know if that's unfair since I didn't warn you.
That is totally unfair because it's impossible to conclude on such a sort of very, very thought-provoking for me and very, very also enriching conversation because of all these different perspectives. I think what's interesting, what I think one of the things that I'm definitely taking away from this is this link between the individual and the institution, the personal and the professional, and how as sophisticated, however sophisticated and precise and formalized we can develop our institutional partnerships, if we don't come to terms with certain very deep questions like the fear of failure and our reaction to that, and our reaction to other people's failure in our immediate environment, obviously all of those are very much threatened and fragilized and really question in their core if we don't have the courage to include and integrate our sort of personal attitudes and relationship towards success, failure, etc. I'm thinking, of course, of our I can't stop thinking about this past weekend's news in the U.S. And it's just so interesting to me, sort of the models of leadership that trickle down. I mean, trickle down economics doesn't work, but trickle down model of leaderships do work. And I think, I think what Trump showed to the world and to at least in the U.S. as far as a leadership method was very indicative. What Biden has chosen as a leadership method, also in partnering with Kamala, is also super interesting because it's very much of a I recognize my own weak point, like weaknesses, and how much added value can be found in a collaboration. And so I think the issue of partnership also, can be modeled at different levels through symbols, like this new partnership that I'm sort of obsessed with this week. But so really, it's impossible for me to conclude this session. I'm very much looking forward to the next sessions, which hopefully will also build on this one. And very much also just wanting to underscore how much I think as EU cities and as a European community of practice, I think we can learn from all the experiences that this conversation is highlighting. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Barbara. I can't believe we're such a small group of people participating in what feels for me like such a progressive and powerful conversation. But I think that what I'm going to do is really try and write up this conversation and really think. And so I'm definitely going to be in touch with you all again and really kind of continue the conversation to get to a point where we can really produce something which talks in a progressive, transparent way about some of the lessons that we've shared with each other today. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It is 6:05. Anna, I don't know if you want to close us off or if we can just say good evening, and to Janice, good morning.
No, thank you very much. This has been fascinating, and I don't think that I will let you go very easily. So we would like to stay in touch with you so that at the end, when we have our last webinar, that we, in line with our titles that are quite provocative, we call it "So What?" So when we get to this "So what," then we really need to hear from you again. Thank you very much. It's been very, very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Bye.